Hi, today we're going to talk about plot. We finished talking about characterization. So in our next couple stories that we read in class, we're going to talk about plot. And I'm going to bring up a slide about plot so that you can follow along. Now this is just an introduction. We're going to add to it on another day, but I want to start slow and make sure you get this part of the concept before we add on other things. So plot is what happens in a story. And whether you know this or not, characters' actions are an important part of this. An old saying among fiction writers is that character is plot, meaning that all good plots develop as a result of choices and actions resulting from the interaction of personalities in a story. So how the characters interact with each other as well as choices that the character makes. So plot's the overall arc of our story, including external events that happen to the characters as well as and in combination with their own actions and choices. So plot moves based on how other characters affect the main characters of the story, as well as choices that that main character makes all by himself, or actions he takes all by himself. So there's external interactions as well as internal interactions within himself, the main character, that affects the plot. Let's look at it this way. An easy way to think of plot is as a three-step process. You have the setup, then you have the build-up, and finally you have the payoff. So in the early part of the story, the author sets up the plot. He sets up the plot. He introduces the characters. He introduces the setting. He communicates to the audience the situation in which the story begins, and he presents some sort of problem, some sort of tension, because you wouldn't have a story if there was not any conflict. There would not be a story if there was not any conflict. So he sets up the setting, he sets up the characters, he sets up the problem. Okay? Next, we have the build-up. So the author builds up that tension, perhaps with events that challenge the characters in unexpected ways. But that tension builds up. That tension in the conflict, the problem, the issue builds up. So we have the setup, we have the build-up, and finally we have the payoff. Okay? After a few rounds of build-up, depending on the length of the story, if it's a short story or novel, the audience is finally provided with some sort of a payoff. Of course, we all like the payoff to be a happy ending, happily ever after story, but sometimes it doesn't end that way. Usually those are cliffhangers, right? So that the author can write another book and we can read the next book in the series. So let's look at an example, because fairy tales are good examples of nearly pure plot. They have the setup, they have the build-up, and then they have the payoff. So think of the familiar tale of Cinderella. We all know that fairy tale, Cinderella, and identify what happens at each step. Like 1, in the setup, Cinderella's at the mercy of that evil stepmother and her mean stepsisters. And there's going to be this ball where the prince is going to pick a bride, which they don't want her to attend. Of course, she wants to go, but they don't want her to. So there's our setup, right? And we all know Cinderella's pretty and she's nice and she's sweet and she's kind. Then you have the build-up. A, Cinderella finds a way to attend the ball, in disguise, of course. B, she meets the prince and they fall in love. C, she flees at midnight and returns to her slavery with her stepmother and stepsisters without the prince even knowing her true identity. And then D, the prince searches and searches but cannot find her. He's trying to find whose foot fits in that glass slipper. Finally, we get the payoff. The prince finally does find Cinderella. Her foot fits into the glass slipper, and he makes her the princess. So, just to repeat, plot centers around characters, interactions, what happens to the main character, what choices does the main character make, and it's the overall arc of the story. There's a 3-step process to plot: setup, build up, payoff. The payoff comes at the end of the story. The setup comes at the beginning of the story, and the build-up is the middle, where we see all the tension and all the problems. And you can always revert back to Cinderella if you need to look back at an example of how it fits into a story. And we will work on plot starting on Monday, because tomorrow is a blogging day and you're going to have a blog post for tomorrow. So get ready to type and I'll see you then.